3 months after I was shot down in Kandahar, I came home with a Purple Heart pinned to my chest. At my own welcome home dinner, my mother rolled her eyes and dismissed it as a little scratch from a training exercise. Then my father, with a voice as cold as a tombstone, delivered the final verdict. "You have always been the disappointment of this family, Brooke." They had no idea that little scratch was about to be honored by the president in a ceremony at the White House. "And my name is Brooke Carter. I am 28 years old and a corporal in the United States Marine Corps. When most people see the uniform, they see a decision born of legacy or patriotism. But for me, it was an act of survival. My story doesn't begin with a noble calling. It begins with a single glowing letter on a computer screen 9 years ago. It begins with an escape. And I was 19, and my world smelled of burnt coffee and failure. I sat in the sterile silence of my dorm room at a California State University, the cinder block walls a constant, gray reminder that I was not where I was supposed to be. On my laptop screen, a single glowing red F in organic chemistry wasn't just a grade, it was a verdict. It was the class my parents had chosen, a non-negotiable step on the path to the medical career they had meticulously mapped out for me. The phone rang, its shrillness an intrusion on my private shame. I knew who it was. In my mother's voice wasn't angry, it was worse. It was the weary, calculated tone of a CEO assessing a portfolio of losing stocks. "Gabe Brooke," she began, the sigh preceding her words. We invested so much. The science camps, the private tutors. I just don't understand why you can't apply yourself. Your brother Trevor, he never put us through this kind of public disappointment." She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what was wrong. She was simply auditing a failed asset, and the unspoken conclusion hung in the air. I was the bad investment. The feeling of being trapped, of suffocating in a life that felt like a costume, tightened its grip around my chest. I was a Carter, and in our world, Carters didn't fail. They went to Yale or Stanford. They didn't get F's at a state school. And the next day, I wandered aimlessly across campus, a ghost in a sea of students who all seemed to be striding toward a future. That's when I saw it. A small, unassuming fold-out table with a banner that read, U.S. Marine Corps, the few, the proud. Behind it sat a woman whose presence was anything but unassuming. Gunnery Sergeant Rivera was a Hispanic woman with a ramrod-straight posture and a steady gaze that seemed to see right through my carefully constructed facade. She wasn't selling glory or spouting patriotic cliches. She was talking about something I'd never had: purpose. Hence the wine. "We're not looking for the 4.0 students," she said to a small group, but her eyes, for a brief electric moment, met mine. "We're looking for the ones who don't quit when that F shows up on the screen. We don't need you to be perfect. We need you to be resilient." And resilient. The word hit me like a physical force. For the first time in my 19 years, I felt seen, not as a daughter who had failed, not as a student with a poor GPA, but as someone whose grit, the only thing I truly owned, might actually be a valuable currency. It wasn't a promise of an easy life. It was a challenge. And it was a challenge I was suddenly, desperately hungry to accept. And that Sunday, I announced my decision over dinner. The scene was a perfect portrait of my family's world in their Beverly Hills home. My mother, Eleanor, slicing a perfectly pink roast beef. My father, Dr. Edward Carter, decanting an expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. My words, "I'm enlisting in the Marine Corps," fell into the room and shattered the crystal-clear tranquility. The gentle clinking of silverware stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, punctuated only by the solemn ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. A clock that measured time in generations of academic achievement. And my father carefully placed his silver fork on his plate. He dabbed his lips with a starched linen napkin, his movements slow and deliberate, a performance of intellectual superiority. He did not look at me. He looked at my mother, his voice as calm and cutting as a surgeon's scalpel. "Eleanor, you see, this is what happens when we are too lenient. The military, it's the last refuge for those with no other options." The words were a calculated assassination of my newfound hope. But Trevor's reaction was the final twisting of the knife. He let out a short, barking laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. "That's rich. My little sister is going to play G.I. Jane. Just try not to get your uniform dirty, Brooke." In their eyes, I wasn't choosing a path of service. I was choosing shame. I wasn't reaching for a purpose. I was admitting defeat. 2 weeks later, I sat in a recruitment office, the pen heavy in my hand. With each deliberate letter of my signature, I wasn't just enlisting in the Marine Corps. I was severing the invisible, suffocating strings they had used to control me my entire life. They thought I was running away from failure, but they didn't know I was running toward the only purpose that had ever felt real. And I understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that I would have to walk that path alone. And the purpose I was running toward wasn't born in that sterile recruitment office. It had taken root years earlier, on quiet Saturday afternoons. These were hours spent in the one place in my family's world where I felt I could breathe, my grandfather's garage. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess, a sanctuary that smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and old, honorable secrets. To my parents, he was a quiet carpenter, a retired Marine who didn't quite fit into their polished, intellectual circle. He was a relic from a different, less refined world. But to me, he was an oracle. And he never spoke of the medals I knew he kept in a locked footlocker under his workbench. His pride wasn't in what he had been given, but in what he had done. He'd let me sit on an old wooden stool, the scent of fresh-cut pine in the air, while he showed me his real trophy, a faded olive-drab canvas medic bag from his service in Vietnam. Its buckles were worn smooth, its fabric frayed from use. He'd point to a dark, rust-colored stain on one of the gauze pockets, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "In that right there," he'd say, his calloused finger gently tracing the edge of the stain. "That's from Corporal Johnson. Took a piece of shrapnel to the chest near Khe Sanh. Held his heart in my hands for 20 minutes, keeping it beating until the dust-off chopper arrived." He'd look at me then, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky, clear and steady. "Saving a life, Brooke," he'd say, the words landing with a profound gravity. "It has a weight to it, a weight no diploma on a wall can ever match." That was the legacy I wanted to inherit, his, not theirs. In his garage was the absolute antithesis of my parents' living room, a pristine, silent space where I always felt more like a visitor on a museum tour than a daughter. The centerpiece of that room, the altar at which my family worshipped, was the grand fireplace. The wall above it was what my mother proudly called the Carter Legacy. It was a shrine to academic and financial success. My father's history Ph.D. from Stanford framed in heavy mahogany. My mother's genetics Ph.D. from Yale, its identical twin. And there, in the center, given the most prominent position, was a framed article from Forbes magazine detailing my brother Trevor's multi-million-dollar tech startup. Every certificate, every accolade was perfectly aligned, a testament to a bloodline of intellectual achievement from which I felt utterly disconnected. I was 14 when I won the district championship for cross-country running. I came home, breathless and heart-pounding with pride, clutching a gold-colored trophy that felt, to me, as heavy and important as the world. My mother took it from my hands, a polite, distant smile, touching her lips but not her eyes. "That's lovely, dear," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she used for a neighbor's new flower beds. She then walked over to the towering built-in bookshelf and placed my trophy on the highest shelf, tucking it partially behind a small abstract bronze sculpture. It was never moved. It was never mentioned again. My sweat, my grit, my hard-won victory, it was just a cute, trivial decoration, not worthy of being displayed alongside the real accomplishments of the family. I learned a valuable lesson that day. My achievements, if they couldn't be framed and hung on the wall, didn't count. And the final nail in the coffin of my self-worth was hammered in the day my SAT scores arrived. The whole family was gathered in the library, a room paneled in dark wood and lined with books that smelled of old paper and intellectual superiority. My scores were decent, good enough for a solid state university, but in the rarefied air of the Carter household, they were a profound public failure. It was an insult to the Ivy League standard they upheld as our birthright. And my father didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took the score report from my trembling hands, his face an impassive mask. He stared at it for a long, silent moment, then turned his gaze to the large bay window, looking out at the perfectly manicured, emerald green lawns of Beverly Hills. He let out a long, slow sigh. It wasn't a sound of anger, but of deep, soul-crushing disappointment, a sound far more painful than any reprimand could ever be. "And well, that's that," he said, not to me, but to my mother, as if I were a piece of furniture, no longer part of the conversation. The Carter academic legacy, I suppose it stops with this generation. And that sentence branded me. I wasn't just a daughter who had underperformed. I was a broken link in the chain, a disappointing interruption to a distinguished history. I was the full stop at the end of their proud, ongoing sentence. And those words, that sigh, that dusty, hidden trophy, they became my fuel. Later, when other recruits were collapsing from exhaustion during the grueling, soul-testing marches at Paris Island, when their bodies and spirits were breaking, I would just close my eyes. I would hear my father's sigh, see my trophy collecting dust in the shadows, and somehow find the strength to get back on my feet. Paris Island, South Carolina, was a special kind of hell, crafted from suffocating humidity, the incessant screaming of drill instructors, and the bone-deep ache that settled into your muscles every night. It was designed to break you down, to strip away the civilian you were, and forge a Marine from the raw, quivering material left behind. For me, it was a crucible in every sense of the word. The physical pain was immense, but it was clean. It was honest. It was a currency I understood, unlike the passive-aggressive warfare of my family's dinner table. Cindy remember one particular moment during the final phase of recruit training, an event aptly named the Crucible. It was a 54-hour field exercise designed to test every limit you had. We were exhausted, sleep-deprived, and running on fumes. During an obstacle course, my foot slipped on a wet log and I plunged into a pit of cold, thick mud. It came up to my chest, its greedy suction pulling me down. I struggled, but my muscles screamed in protest. For a fleeting second, I thought about giving up. The mud was strangely peaceful, a quiet place to just stop fighting. And then I saw her. Gunnery Sergeant Rivera stood on the edge of the pit, her hands on her hips, her face a mask of stone. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a word of encouragement. She just barked, her voice cutting through my exhaustion. "Carter, your PhD daddy isn't here to pull you out. Your mommy isn't here to coddle you. Your platoon is waiting on the other side. Get up." On her words were a jolt of electricity. Your platoon is waiting. It was a simple statement, but it held a power I had never known. I was part of something. I was needed. I gritted my teeth against the burning in my arms, dug my fingers into the slick clay bank, and clawed my way out. I emerged covered in mud, smelling of the swamp, but my heart was filled with a fierce, defiant resolve. Here, weakness wasn't a family disgrace. It was simply an obstacle to be overcome. 13 weeks later, I stood on the parade deck, no longer a recruit, but a Marine. I graduated with honors, my name called out, for high marks in marksmanship and physical fitness. That afternoon, I was given my 15-minute phone call home. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the familiar Beverly Hills number. A foolish, stubborn hope fluttering in my chest. Maybe now they would see. Maybe now they would be proud. And I timed the call for Sunday evening, knowing they'd be in the middle of their dinner ritual. My mother answered, her voice distant, filtered through the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation. "Joe, it's you, Brooke. Is everything all right? Your father and Trevor are just discussing the prospectus for the upcoming IPO Jatorni. And everything's great, Mom," I said, my voice too loud, too eager. "Yeah, I graduated today, with honors. I was at the top of my platoon in IA." And she cut me off, not unkindly, but with the casual disinterest of someone swatting away a fly. That's nice, dear. That's very good. Listen, I have to go. The dessert is being served. You take care of yourself now." The line went dead. The call had lasted less than 2 minutes. The dial tone that buzzed in my ear was louder and more jarring than any rifle fire on the training range. I stood there, holding the cold receiver, the pride I had felt just moments before, draining out of me, leaving an empty, aching void. Ace and my first Christmas leave, I went home determined to show them the woman I had become. I wore my Marine Corps dress blues, the midnight blue jacket and crisp white cap, a symbol of everything I had endured and accomplished. I thought naively that the uniform itself would command a sliver of respect. I was wrong. In I walked into the living room where a towering, professionally decorated Christmas tree glittered with lights. Trevor looked up from his phone, a smirk instantly spreading across his face. He looked me up and down, then let out a condescending chuckle. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Are you auditioning for a part in a movie, Brooke? When does this whole Halloween dress-up thing end?" And my mother rushed over, her face a mask of practiced distress. "Oh, darling," she whispered, tugging at the sleeve of my jacket, as if it were contaminated. "That uniform is so masculine. Don't you have a pretty dress you could wear for our family Christmas dinner?" The uniform, the one I had earned with blood, sweat, and tears. The one that signified my commitment to something larger than myself. In their world, it was nothing more than a bizarre costume, an embarrassing deviation from the norm, a stain on their perfect family portrait. And that night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I carefully took off the uniform piece by piece. I folded the jacket with the precision the drill instructors had beaten into me, the sharp creases a testament to a discipline they would never understand. I caught my reflection in the dark window pane. Behind me, the festive lights of the Christmas tree blurred into a soft, colorful glow, a symbol of a warmth and belonging I would never find within these walls. It was then that I truly understood. My family wasn't here. My family was out there, somewhere else, waiting for me. The family I had been searching for wasn't waiting for me in a pristine house in Beverly Hills. They were waiting for me in the dust and chaos of Kandahar Airfield, Afghanistan. This new world was a shock to the system. The sun was a relentless hammer. The air was a thick cocktail of sand and diesel fumes, and the constant roar of C-130s and helicopters became the soundtrack to our lives. My new family was my squad, a motley crew of 5 souls thrown together from every corner of America. On there was our platoon leader, Lieutenant Martinez, a quiet man from Texas whose calm demeanor and steady eyes were an anchor in the storm. Our machine gunner, O'Malley, was a fast-talking Boston native, whose profanity was as creative as it was constant, a defense mechanism against the fear we all felt. And then there was Lance, a farm boy from Iowa, barely 20, who wrote to his mom every single day without fail. They were my brothers, and I, their corpsman, Doc Carter. In the first night, the distant crackle of gunfire echoed across the perimeter. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I was trying to hide my trembling hands when Lance sat down next to me on my cot. He didn't say a word. He just pushed a slightly melted Hershey's chocolate bar into my hand. "My mom sent it," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "She says chocolate makes everything a little better." It was a simple, clumsy gesture, but in that moment, under the dim light of a single bulb, it felt more profound than any conversation I'd ever had with my own family. I had found my people. Aiken Mail Call was the emotional epicenter of our deployment. It was a weekly ritual of hope and, for me, a recurring lesson in disappointment. We'd gather around as the mail clerk called out names. O'Malley would get care packages filled with cookies from his wife that he'd grudgingly share. Lance's face would light up as he received long, multi-page letters from his mother. Lieutenant Martinez would get crayon drawings from his 5-year-old daughter, which he'd tape to the inside of his helmet. And then there was me. Week after week, I'd watch, a knot of hope tightening in my chest, only to hear the clerk call the last name and turn away. My slot in the mail container remained empty. At first, I made excuses for them. They were busy. The international mail system was slow, but after 2 months of crushing silence, the truth settled in like a cold, heavy stone. I was forgotten. One afternoon, Martinez saw me staring at the empty mail bin long after everyone else had left. He walked over, not with pity, but with a quiet understanding. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Carter," he said softly, "letters from home are a luxury. The person standing next to you, that's a necessity." He tore his own peanut butter and jelly sandwich in half and handed me a piece. It was squashed and warm from the sun, but it tasted better than any 5-star roast beef I'd ever had at home. The reality of our purpose here hit us a month later. Our convoy was on patrol when the world exploded. An IED ripped through the lead Humvee, flipping it onto its side in a ball of fire and black smoke. It was O'Malley's vehicle. My training kicked in, a cold, clear wave washing over the panic. All I could hear was my grandfather's voice, "Saving a life, Brooke. It has a weight to it." I ran toward the burning wreck while others were still taking cover. O'Malley was trapped inside, his leg impaled by a jagged piece of shrapnel, blood pulsing from the wound. As enemy fire started peppering the ground around us, I dragged him out, applied a tourniquet, and worked to stop the bleeding, shielding his body with my own, until the medevac chopper's blades roared overhead. And a few weeks later, under the unforgiving Afghan sun, the entire platoon stood at attention. Lieutenant Martinez stood before me, his face serious. He pinned a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal to my chest. His voice was steady and clear for all to hear. "Here, we don't care where you came from or who your father is. We care about what you do when it matters." He looked me straight in the eye. "And what you did, Doc, was save one of our own. You saved our brother." For the first time, a medal on my chest felt heavy. It had meaning, it had weight. On that night, I used my satellite phone time to call home, my heart soaring with a pride I couldn't contain. My mother answered, her voice tinny and distant, nearly drowned out by the sound of music and laughter. "A party?" I asked. "And a charity gala, dear," she said. "For the museum." Ian and I told her about the medal, about O'Malley, my voice rushing to get the words out. "Oh," she said, her tone flat. That's wonderful, sweetie. By the way, I have fabulous news. Trevor just made junior partner at his firm. We are all just bursting with pride." The line crackled. "I have to run, darling. They're starting the auction." The line went dead. The long, empty buzz that followed was more deafening than the explosion that had earned me the medal. The commendation medal didn't change anything back home. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. The shadow of my family stretched all the way from Beverly Hills to the mountains of Afghanistan. A constant, chilling reminder that in their eyes I was still on the wrong path. The disconnect between my two worlds became starkly, painfully clear a few months after I'd saved O'Malley. I received a rare email from my father. There was no greeting, no inquiry about my well-being. It was a single curt line. "In on your grandmother is scheduled for hip replacement surgery at Cedars-Sinai next month. Your mother thinks it would be appropriate for you to request leave to come home and assist with her recovery. You have medical experience after all." Ed and I stared at the screen, a cold disbelief washing over me. Request leave. He wrote it as if I were working a 9-to-5 office job in downtown LA, not serving in a combat zone where leave was a near impossibility and every day was a gamble. The sheer arrogance of the request, the complete and utter disregard for the reality of my life, was staggering. To them, my deployment, my duty, my very life here was a part-time hobby that could be paused for family convenience. I replied with a brief professional email, explaining that taking leave was not an option. He never wrote back. The silence was his judgment. Isn't the final proof of their detachment arrived during my second Christmas in country? A package arrived with my name on it, bearing my mother's elegant handwriting. A flicker of hope, a foolish, stubborn thing, ignited within me. Maybe this time, maybe she finally understood. My whole squad gathered around as I tore it open, their curiosity a warm, welcome presence. They were more excited than I was. And inside, there was no Christmas candy, no warm socks, no taste of home. Instead, my fingers brushed against glossy, heavy paper. It was a thick, pristine course catalog for the Keck School of Medicine at USC. Tucked inside was a full set of application forms, my name and personal details already neatly typed into the required fields. A small, cream-colored note card was clipped to the front. On it, my mother had written, "Brooke, It's time to start thinking seriously about your real future. This little adventure of yours can't last forever. And the air went out of the room. O'Malley, who was looking over my shoulder, let out a low whistle, followed by a sharp curse. "Are you kidding me? They think you're at summer camp?" The rest of the squad fell silent, an awkward, protective quiet. A hot wave of shame and anger washed over me, so intense it made my face burn. They hadn't sent a gift, they had sent a correction. A beautifully packaged, condescending attempt to erase the life I had chosen and replace it with the one they had designed. I quietly closed the box, the dream of a medical career now feeling more like a threat than an ambition. Weeks later, we received intel about a high-risk operation. It was a mission deep in hostile territory, and the tension on the base was palpable. The night before we were set to leave, I felt a deep, primal need to hear a familiar voice, a foolish search for some small comfort. I used the satellite phone to call home. I kept my message intentionally vague. "Hi, it's me. I'm just calling to say I'll be out of communication for a few days for a work thing. I'll call again when I can." My father answered. The line was silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then he spoke, his voice devoid of any warmth, carrying the cold, analytical tone of a historian delivering a lecture. "Brooke," he said, his words precise and measured. "Remember this. Soldiers are rewarded for following orders, not for acts of misplaced heroism. Don't try to be something you're not. Keep your head down, fulfill the terms of your contract, and then you can come home and begin a real life." It wasn't advice. It wasn't a father's worried plea for his daughter's safety. It was a command. Be mediocre. Be invisible. Do nothing that might bring further embarrassment upon this family. He was telling me to survive not for my own sake, but for theirs, to avoid the inconvenience my death might cause them. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling not from fear of the coming mission, but from a cold, profound rage. His words, "Don't be a hero," echoed in my mind, a toxic mantra. But just then, Lieutenant Martinez ducked into the tent, his face grim, holding a tactical map. He began to brief us on the hostage rescue mission, his voice a low, steady current of resolve. As I looked at the coordinates, at the red circles marking enemy positions, I knew one thing for certain. Keeping my head down was not an option, and my real life was about to begin. And we were flying low and fast over the jagged peaks of Kunar Province, the blades of the Black Hawk chopping through the cold, thin night air. Inside there was no conversation, only the hum of the engines and the quiet, focused ritual of checking gear. My team, a Special Operations Support Unit, was on a mission to rescue civilian aid workers held hostage in a remote mountain village. This was the razor's edge. This was what all the training was for. And then, in an instant, the world ended. A deafening explosion ripped through the belly of the helicopter. The floor beneath me buckled. A flash of orange light seared my vision, followed by the terrifying high-pitched scream of tearing metal. We were thrown against the fuselage as the Black Hawk entered a violent, uncontrolled spin. I heard shouts, a prayer, then only the roar of the wind and the sickening lurch in my stomach as we plummeted toward the ground. The impact was a physical obliteration of the senses. Darkness, a wave of agony, the taste of blood and jet fuel. And when consciousness clawed its way back, it came with a single, sharp point of focus. A white-hot, searing pain in my left leg. I looked down, my helmet light cutting a frantic beam through the dust-filled wreckage. A piece of the fuselage, a jagged shard of metal, was buried deep in my calf. All around me, the air was filled with the low, desperate moans of my teammates. We were down, we were alive, and we were surrounded. Then my father's voice, a cold whisper from another universe. Don't try to be something you're not. Keep your head down. The thought vanished as quickly as it came, obliterated by a new sound. Lance, the farm boy from Iowa, was choking, a wet, gurgling sound. My training slammed into place, a cold, hard shield against the panic and pain. I fumbled in my medic bag, my fingers clumsy. I found a syringe of morphine, ripped off the cap with my teeth, and plunged it into my own thigh. The pain receded to a dull, manageable roar. Now I could work. On I crawled toward Lance, dragging my useless leg behind me. Every movement sent a fresh wave of fire up my spine. His eyes were wide with panic, a sucking chest wound. "Easy, buddy, easy," I whispered, my voice a strained rasp. "I got you." I worked quickly, my hands moving with a life of their own, applying an occlusive dressing to seal the wound. He started breathing easier. One down. And next was Martinez. Our lieutenant was slumped against a piece of wreckage, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Compound fracture. He was losing blood fast. "Talk to me, sir," I said, my hands already finding a vein, prepping an IV line. In the pitch-black darkness of the ruined helicopter, illuminated only by the faint, flickering beam of my headlamp, I started a transfusion. I splinted his arm, my mind a blur of procedures and checklists. And for the next 48 hours, that wreckage was my world. I was the only one mobile. I was the only one who could fight. The line between corpsman and rifleman evaporated. I was both. I scuttled from one wounded man to the next, a frantic, crab-like crawl through the debris. I changed dressings, monitored vitals, administered antibiotics, and kept them talking, kept them conscious, kept them alive. All the while, my ears were straining, listening for the snap of a twig, the crunch of boots on gravel, the sound of the enemy closing in. They were out there, hunting us. And by the second day, our situation was critical. Our water was nearly gone. The battery on our primary radio was dying. O'Malley was fading from a secondary infection. We needed an airstrike. We needed extraction. But the radio signal was too weak from inside the wreckage. Someone had to get out into the open. I looked at the faces of my team. Martinez, pale and grimacing. Lance, breathing shallowly. O'Malley, his eyes glassy with fever. They were my family. And you don't let your family die. I knew what I had to do. Ian and I checked the magazine on my rifle, took a deep breath, and began to crawl out from under a twisted piece of the tail boom. The pain in my leg was a distant, roaring fire. I bit down hard on a piece of leather from my glove to keep from crying out. The moment I cleared the wreckage, I felt it, the chilling sensation of being seen, of being in the crosshairs. A sniper. In a puff of dust erupted just inches from my head. Then another. Zip. Thwack. They were walking the rounds in, trying to find me. I flattened myself to the ground, my heart hammering against my ribs. I kept crawling, using rocks for cover. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 30 yards. I found a small depression in the ground, a shallow rock outcropping that offered minimal cover. It would have to do. And with trembling hands, I pulled out the small secondary radio. I took a steadying breath, picturing the map in my head. I began to speak, my voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos in my chest. Should Jaguar 22, this is Voodoo 16, over. Requesting immediate fire mission. Enemy position, grid coordinates, 3907, 821. and the sniper's rounds were getting closer, kicking up dirt that stung my eyes. I kept talking, relaying target descriptions, adjusting the coordinates based on muzzle flashes I could see in the rocks above. "Key, danger close," I repeat, "danger close." And then the sky split open. A pair of A-10 Warthogs screamed overhead, their cannons erupting in a sound that wasn't just heard, but felt deep in your bones, a glorious, terrifying brrrr-tee that tore the mountainside apart. The enemy positions vanished in a cascade of fire and smoke. Silence followed, a profound, ringing silence. Ike and I lay there in the dirt, completely spent, the radio still clutched in my hand. The adrenaline drained away, leaving only a vast ocean of pain and exhaustion. I looked up at the impossible, brilliant tapestry of the Afghan night sky, more stars than I had ever seen, and I started to cry, not from fear or pain. It was a strange, overwhelming sense of release. I had done the one thing my father had commanded me never to do. I had been a hero, and in that moment, covered in dirt and my own blood, I had never felt more real. And when the rescue team finally reached us, the last thing I saw before I blacked out was Martinez's face, leaning over me. He didn't speak, he just gave a short, sharp nod, a nod of respect. A nod that was worth more than every hollow compliment I had ever craved from my family. It was recognition, and as I drifted into darkness, I knew that was all I ever needed. When I woke up in a pristine white hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, my first foolish thought was of home. The first call I made was to my parents, with the stupid, stubborn hope that this time things would be different. And I woke up in the sterile white world of the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The beeping of monitors the only sound in the room. The first few days were a blur of pain medication, surgeries to remove the shrapnel, and the quiet, efficient care of the army nurses. But through the haze, one thought remained stubbornly clear. I had survived. My team had survived. And that foolish, stubborn hope, it was flickering back to life. Maybe this brush with death, would be the thing to finally break through their armor. So when I was stable enough, they let me make a call. My hands were shaking as I dialed, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. My mother answered. "Anina, I'm in a hospital in Germany," I said, my voice weak, raspy. I was wounded." And there was a pause on the line, a beat of silence that felt heavier than the entire helicopter wreckage. I waited for the gasp, the worried questions, the flood of motherly concern. It never came. And instead, her voice, when it finally arrived, was laced with an unmistakable edge of annoyance. "Oh, Brooke, for heaven's sake, is it serious? Will this affect your contract?" I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass. She continued, her voice dripping with calculated concern. "Your father and I were just saying, perhaps this is a sign. A good opportunity for you to reconsider your direction." And they didn't ask if I was in pain. They didn't ask what happened. My wound, the piece of metal that had torn through my flesh, wasn't a trauma to them. It was an inconvenience, an administrative issue, a potential exit ramp off the embarrassing detour my life had taken. I mumbled something noncommittal and hung up, the cold plastic of the phone feeling like a block of ice against my ear. The emotional anesthetic they had just administered was more potent than any drug the doctors had given me. 3 months later, after weeks of grueling physical therapy, I was granted convalescent leave. I flew home to Los Angeles, a slight but permanent limp in my step. In my duffel bag, nestled amongst my clothes, was the Purple Heart medal they had pinned to my uniform in a quiet ceremony at the hospital. And my mother insisted on a welcome home dinner. It was a torture session disguised as a celebration. The dining room was impeccably set with the family's finest china and silver. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the sound of my father and brother's voices. The entire meal was a monologue dedicated to the glorification of Trevor. He had just secured $20 million in a new round of venture capital funding. He was flying to Zurich. He was buying a new Porsche. I sat there, a ghost at the feast, pushing my food around my plate, feeling my own invisibility cloak settle around me. Then the only person who seemed to see me was Sarah, Trevor's fiancée. She was an outsider, not yet indoctrinated. She turned to me, her eyes wide with genuine curiosity. "Brooke, I heard you were awarded the Purple Heart. That's just incredible." And the entire table fell silent. My mother slowly turned her head. She gave a small, dismissive laugh, and then looked at Sarah with an air of condescending pity. "Oh, that," she said, with a flick of her wrist. She rolled her eyes, a gesture I knew as well as my own reflection. "It was just a little scratch from some training exercise, sweetie. Nothing to make a fuss about." "A little scratch." The words landed in the center of the table like grenades. The dam of a decade's worth of swallowed anger finally broke. I set my fork down with a soft, deliberate clink that echoed in the silence. I looked directly at my mother, my voice dangerously calm. "It wasn't a training exercise, Mom. I was shot down. I was wounded by enemy fire while trying to keep my team alive." And my father jumped in, his voice sharp with irritation. "You could be saving lives in a hospital right here, Brooke, without all this theatricality. You don't need to be playing war hero." And that was it, the final condescension. The rage that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. "Playing war hero?" My voice rose, shaking with a fury I no longer tried to control. "I performed emergency surgical procedures under active enemy fire that most doctors at your precious Cedars-Sinai wouldn't dare attempt. I kept 4 men alive for 48 hours with nothing but my medic bag and a shattered leg." The room was electric. Sarah's face was pale. Trevor looked stunned. My father's face was a mask of crimson rage. He slammed his hand on the table, the wine glasses jumping. He stood up, his tall frame looming over me. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, his voice a guttural roar. That is enough," he bellowed. "You have always been the disappointment of this family, Brooke. Always." And the words hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Disappointment. That was all I was, all I ever would be to him. And as I stood there, looking at his furious face, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. I wasn't looking at my father anymore. I was looking at a stranger. Chenia, I have to ask you, the one who is listening to my story right now. Tin, have you ever had that moment? In the one where you look at a person you're supposed to love, a parent, a sibling, a spouse, and the person you thought you knew is gone, and in their place is someone who is willing to break you just to prove they are right. So that was my moment. The moment the person I had spent my life trying to please simply ceased to exist. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out. I didn't look back. As I walked into the cool California night, the tears finally came. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of a strange, painful, and absolute liberation. The heavy, suffocating shadow of their expectations had finally, irrevocably lifted. I had nothing left to prove to them, and nothing left to lose. 6 months later, while I was working to rebuild my life at the National Naval Medical Center, a call came from a blocked number. It was the Pentagon, and it changed everything. In the call from the Pentagon was surreal. A calm, bureaucratic voice on the other end of the line informed me that due to the declassification of certain operational details, my actions had been reviewed. I was to be awarded the Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism. The ceremony, the voice continued, would be held at the White House. The medal would be presented by the President of the United States. Isenai sent a formal, engraved invitation to my family. I did it not out of any lingering hope for their approval, but out of a cold, final sense of duty. It was a test. My mother's response over the phone was exactly the passing grade of indifference I had expected. The White House? Oh my. Well, I'll have to check my calendar. Your father is terribly busy this month, and Trevor is supposed to be in London for business. Her tone was that of someone being asked to attend a tedious school play. Eventually, after a dramatic pause, meant to convey the magnitude of her sacrifice, she confirmed they would attend. They never once asked why I was receiving a medal that would be presented by the president. To them, it was just another social engagement, and a rather inconvenient one at that. And on the day of the ceremony, I stood tall in my dress blues, the crisp fabric of familiar armor against the world. The East Room of the White House was dazzling, a grand chamber steeped in gold drapery, shimmering chandeliers, and the hushed, reverent air of history. I spotted my family near the back, a small, awkward island in a sea of decorated military officers and government officials. They looked utterly out of place, their expensive civilian clothes somehow looking cheap and flimsy next to the uniforms. My mother fidgeted with her pearl necklace, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for someone more important to talk to. Trevor, ever the tech mogul, was staring down at his phone, scrolling endlessly. And my father, my brilliant, accomplished father, kept glancing at his Patek Philippe watch, a gesture of profound boredom. And then a military aide's voice cut through the silence. "Corporal Brooke Carter?" Amit and I walked to the stage, my limp barely noticeable, my back ramrod straight. A 4-star Marine general, a man whose face looked like it was carved from granite, stepped to the podium. His voice was deep and resonant, filling every corner of the grand room as he began to read the citation. Then he spoke of the helicopter crash, of the ambush, of the overwhelming enemy force. He detailed how, despite my own grievous injuries, I had provided life-saving medical care to 4 critically wounded teammates for 48 hours straight. My family's reaction, which I observed from the corner of my eye, was a slow-motion study in dawning horror. Han, with complete disregard for her own safety, the general's voice boomed, the words echoing off the historic walls. Corporal Carter crawled under direct enemy sniper fire to reach an exposed position. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her carefully applied lipstick now a smudge of shock. Her eyes, for the first time, were wide with a fear that was genuine. And from that position, she directed a precision airstrike, neutralizing the enemy threat and ensuring the survival of her entire team. I saw Trevor's phone slip from his hand and clatter onto the floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. He sat rigid in his chair, his usual confident smirk completely erased, replaced by a slack-jawed vacancy. And I saw my father. For the first time in my memory, he wasn't leaning back with an air of intellectual detachment. He was sitting bolt upright, his back as straight as any Marine's on that parade deck. His eyes, magnified slightly by his expensive glasses, were locked on me with a stunned, unblinking intensity. The man who had dismissed my service as a last refuge was now hearing its unvarnished, brutal truth from a source he could not possibly discredit. And then the President of the United States stepped forward. He took the Navy Cross, its blue ribbon brilliant against his dark suit, and placed it around my neck. The weight of it on my chest was real, substantial, a grounding force. He shook my hand firmly, but then he leaned in, his public smile unwavering, his voice low and for my ears alone. "Tiens, the citation doesn't tell the whole story, Corporal," he said, his voice dropping even lower, filled with a raw emotion that stunned me into silence. "The intelligence you provided during that firefight, the coordinates you called in, it led to a secondary operation, an operation that rescued not only the original hostages, but 24 other civilians from a separate compound. One of those civilians was my younger brother." Alnai stared at him, my mind reeling, the roar of the room fading to a distant hum. The President stepped back to the podium, his public persona firmly back in place. His voice now carried a different weight, a personal authority that commanded absolute silence. "What Corporal Carter did," he said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me, "was not only save her team, she prevented 3 separate, planned terrorist attacks on American soil. Corporal Brooke Carter," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "you saved more American lives than any of us will ever fully know." And he looked at me and nodded. The room erupted in a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. As I stood there, bathed in the flash of cameras and the roar of applause, the truth didn't just come to light. It detonated, shattering the carefully constructed reality my family had lived in for years. Later, at the formal reception, I was surrounded. Generals shook my hand. Senators clapped me on the back. A woman I didn't know, her face streaked with tears, hugged me and whispered that because of me, her 5-year-old daughter still had a mother. And across the room I saw them, my family. They were huddled in a corner, looking small, lost, and utterly defeated. For the first time in my life, they were the ones who didn't belong. For the first time, it was not I, but they, who were the outsiders. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the metal hanging on my chest, that the real confrontation had only just begun. The thunderous applause eventually faded, but the aftershock of the ceremony lingered in the air. At the reception, I felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of needing their approval had been lifted, and in its place was a quiet, unshakable certainty. I was no longer the one on the outside looking in. They were. And eventually, they navigated the crowded room and approached me, a trinity of discomfort. My father, the great Dr. Edward Carter, a man who could command a lecture hall of hundreds, couldn't meet my gaze. My mother, her face a pale mask of regret, wrung her hands. Trevor looked like a lost child. And Brooke, my mother began, her voice a reedy whisper. We had no idea. And I looked at her, at the woman whose validation I had craved for so long. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and devoid of accusation. It was simply a statement of fact. "You never asked." And the 3 words hung in the air between us, more powerful than any shouting match could ever be. They contained a decade of unanswered questions, of overlooked achievements, of profound, willful ignorance. Trevor, my arrogant, dismissive older brother, looked at me with a new, desperate confusion. Is it all true? What they said? Even before I could answer, A solid, reassuring presence appeared by my side. It was Lieutenant, now Major, Martinez. He had been one of the few special guests I had invited personally. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of unwavering solidarity. He didn't look at me, he looked directly at Trevor, his eyes hard as flint. "Every single word is true," he said, his voice low and firm. "I was there. I watched your sister crawl through hell to save my life and the lives of my men." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "She is the finest Marine I have ever had the honor of serving with." And my family stared, speechless. The truth delivered by a man who embodied the very honor they had never understood was undeniable. They had no response. On that night, back in my quiet hotel room in D.C., the apologies began. The first call was from Trevor. The condescending, mocking tone I had known my entire life was gone, replaced by a strained, choked voice. "Brooke, I am so sorry," he stammered. "I've been an arrogant ass. I had no idea. I never understood." It was the first honest thing he had ever said to me. On a few minutes later, my mother called, her words punctuated by racking sobs. She was sorry, so deeply sorry, so ashamed. She went on and on about how she had failed me, how she wished she could take it all back. I listened, a strange detachment settling over me. Their apologies, while seemingly sincere, felt like trying to patch a bullet hole with a Band-Aid. They couldn't erase the years of calculated indifference, the lonely nights in Afghanistan, or the raw humiliation of that last dinner. The wound was too deep. And when she finally paused for breath, I spoke, my voice calm and clear. "I need time. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't offer absolution. I simply drew a line in the sand, a boundary for my own sanity." A week later, my father came to see me at my small temporary apartment in Washington, D.C. He looked out of place, a titan of academia adrift in my simple, government-issued living room. He didn't offer a tearful apology like my mother, or a raw confession like my brother. That wasn't his way. He just stood there for a long time, looking at the Navy Cross, which I had placed on the mantelpiece. Then finally he spoke, his voice quiet, analytical. "That day at the White House," he began, still staring at the medal, "I watched the generals, the senators, the president. I saw the way they looked at you." He turned to face me, and his eyes held a strange mixture of awe and defeat. "They looked at you with respect, a deep, earned respect." He shook his head slowly. "I've been in academia for 40 years. I've published a dozen books. I have never, not once, commanded that kind of respect." It was the only way he knew how to say it. It wasn't an apology for a lack of love, but a concession of status. He was acknowledging that my currency, courage, honor, sacrifice, was in this new world worth more than his. In that moment, I realized something profound. His respect, which I had once so desperately coveted, no longer mattered. I didn't need his love or his approval to know my own value. I had earned my own. And they had started to change, it was true. Their world had been shaken, their certainties shattered. But as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, I was left with a question that had no easy answer. Could a relationship, rebuilt from the ashes of regret and shame, ever be truly whole? And more importantly, after everything I had been through, after everything I had become, did I even need it to be? That question followed me as I began to walk into the first chapter of my new life. In my new life is quiet. It unfolds not under the harsh sun of Afghanistan, but under the thoughtful, fluorescent lights of a classroom at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Today, I am an instructor, I train the next generation of Navy corpsmen and Army combat medics. My students are young, eager, and terrified, just as I once was. But I don't teach them from a textbook. I teach them from my scars. The slight, permanent limp in my walk is a constant lesson in the cost of survival. Anne and I stand before them, not as a hero, but as a testament. A medal on your chest doesn't make you a medic, I tell them, my voice steady. What makes you a medic is the willingness to run toward the sound of the wounded when everyone else is running away. In their eyes, I don't see the judgment I once knew. I see respect. Here, I am not the disappointment of the Carter family. I am Corporal Carter, a survivor. My legacy isn't written in a Forbes article. It's written in the lives I saved, and now in the lives I am preparing to save others. This is a weight I am proud to carry. My family, in their own way, has been trying to understand that weight. The change hasn't been miraculous, but it has been real. Trevor, in a move that shocked me most, began volunteering his weekends at a legal aid clinic for veterans. He calls me sometimes, asking questions, trying to comprehend the world he so casually dismissed. My mother sends care packages, filled not with medical school catalogs, but with thick wool socks, good coffee, and books she thinks I'll enjoy. During a recent visit home, I saw that she had cleared a prominent space on the living room bookshelf, right where my lonely trophy once collected dust. In its place now stood a glass display case. Inside, my Navy Cross and Purple Heart lay on a bed of dark blue velvet. Beside them was a single faded photograph of my team in Kandahar, smiling and covered in dust. My mother saw me looking at it. "I should have honored your service long ago," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion I wasn't used to hearing from her. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time." And I accepted these gestures, these fragile olive branches, but with a quiet, protective distance. A wound can heal, but the scar tissue remains, a permanent reminder of the injury. And we even went to family therapy, a step I took with deep reluctance. It was there, in the sterile quiet of a therapist's office, that the final truth came out. My mother, through tears, confessed her terror of receiving a knock on the door from two Marines in dress uniform. My father, in his analytical way, admitted his fear that I would end up like my grandfather, a man he respected, but also pitied for the quiet, invisible wounds he carried home from his war. Some their fear had manifested as anger and disappointment. Their desire to protect me had twisted into a need to control me. I understood it on an intellectual level, but understanding is not the same as absolution. Their fear didn't excuse the pain they had caused. In looking at them in that room, stripped of their academic and financial armor, looking simply like two aging, regretful parents, I had a final, profound realization. The presidential ceremony, the medals, the public vindication, they hadn't been the moment of my liberation. I had freed myself long before that. And I freed myself in the mud of Paris Island when I chose to stand up on my own. I freed myself under fire in Afghanistan when I chose to run toward my brother in arms. And I freed myself in their dining room when I finally chose my own truth over their approval. My value was never theirs to give. It was always there, inside me, forged in hardship, waiting for me to be the one to finally recognize it. And my journey was never about winning their acceptance. It was about finding my own. And now, when I look to the future, I no longer see their shadow looming over me. I see a clear and open road. I see the sunrise. And thank you for walking this path with me. My story is one of finding my own sunrise, And I know so many of you have had to find yours too. Your journey, your resilience, deserves to be honored. Can if my story resonated with you, please share your own moment of finding strength in the comments below. Your experience could be the light someone else needs to see. And to help us share more stories that matter, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support makes all the difference. Chuckian Hanan.